Hey guys, my name's Crystal Kenny, and I'm in love with creating. All things artistic and imagination involved. I'm an American girl who chased her creative dreams all the way to Paris, France, making a living using photography. This podcast takes you inside the stories of all the artsy folks I've met along the way and gives you that extra push to discover your creative gifts. The desire to create is deeply inside each and every one of us, and I give you the tools and inspiration to find a new way of living a more creative life. This is La Vie Creative, the podcast. Claudine Hemingway is a descendant of famed writer Ernest Hemingway. We bumped into each other at a party and decided to team up and dive deep into French history, but with a twist, by bringing a spotlight to those lesser-known creatives in France. This is History with a Hemingway. Welcome back to Paris History Avec a Hemingway, and I think she is very suited to talk about the topic today because we are talking about Ernest Hemingway. And there's a lot of things that we think are true about him, or we're not sure, or who knows. But today, Claudine is going to clear up all of that for us and talk about the myths versus the facts of Hemingway. So I'll let Claudine take it from here.
Yeah, this one, I kind of was inspired to share this one because I, at times, get quite frustrated.
It is frustrating.
The things that even major publications put out, some of the things that they say are the things that happened, especially during the Paris years of Ernest Hemingway, and what is actually the truth. And recently, just this last spring, Ken Burns did a documentary about it, a 3-part documentary. It's about 6 hours in total. It was very well done because Ken Burns does amazing work. A lot of it, actually, part of it frustrated me because I was more surprised at some of the things that they didn't say, or some of the very leaning way that they told some of the stories.
So even he didn't tell the whole truth.
Yeah, and the whole thing about the TV show was actually basically, it was like I think it was called The Myth of Hemingway. And so it is an interesting, take on it because, Hemingway himself definitely, he created this world and this story of what his life was. And he did it, obviously through his writing. And over time, I think that just, it's like the game of telephone. It just keeps going and going and expanding and changing. So it's changed constantly over time. He created this myth, but then the people that love and adore him, which are fantastic, they end up adding to that myth as well and making it even bigger and also changing it.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's a game of telephone.
It is. It's a very big game of telephone. And then you add in the internet.
Yeah.
And then it's just out of control. So I thought, you know what? I will try and do my own tiny little part.
My own tiny little part.
Yeah. And so I actually kind of had a hard time to narrow down which things. So we didn't make this, 2 hours. But I kind of picked some of the ones that are the most well-known, that people actually know. And of course, I first decided let's talk about Movable Feast, the book that most everybody loves. If you love Paris, if you're going to Paris, or if you've been to Paris, The Movable Feast is a book you adore. After the terrorist attacks in Paris, The Movable Feast ended up skyrocketing to the bestseller list again and selling out everywhere. They had to do a whole nother printing of it, because it is basically dedicated to his love of Paris.
Yeah.
And those years that he spent there. But the thing about The Movable Feast is that it was, it's this big story about how it was discovered in this trunk in the Ritz. It was actually at the end of the 1920s. He ended up having a trunk of old things. There were some manuscripts in there. There was some old clothes in there. It was just, this junky trunk of things that he had. It somehow ended up getting to the Ritz. When he left Paris at the end of the 1920s, he had married Pauline. He was, definitely, this was after he published The Sun Also Rises. He was, definitely became famous. He was definitely, because of Pauline, he was doing pretty well financially. So he had this, they ended up leaving and coming back for the birth of his son, Patrick. And so this trunk ended up in March of 1928 getting left in the basement of the Ritz. A lot of things, a lot of different people like to tell the story that it was a trunk made by Louis Vuitton himself for Ernest Hemingway,
And that's not true.
which is a really cool thing to think. But Louis Vuitton, the man himself that created the company, actually died in the late 1800s.
Yes, and not the same time.
No, so Louis was not bending leather and putting in his initials. It is, I have seen many times that it was still a trunk by Louis Vuitton, but that could or could not be true, but it definitely was not made by the man himself. But in 1956, the Ritz manager sent a letter to Hemingway saying, "Hey, we found this trunk here. You come and get it. We don't want it anymore." So he asked him to send it to him. So they boxed it all up and they sent it down to Key West to him. Inside of it, it had his pages for what he called the Paris sketches. And these were of his early days when he was in Paris. He put it away when he got it. And then he, a few years later, he, looked back at them and started reading them and started kind of working on them again. And then again, he just kind of put them away. In the last few months of his life, he actually started working on them, pretty much all the time. He, if you have read the book, if you have not read the book, it's basically, the Paris sketches is kind of a better way to describe it because it's all these different stories of his time in Paris. But basically, when he got there, when he was, when he and Hadley first arrived, there's a lot about Hadley in there. And then there's a lot about the other people in Paris. And then, of course, a lot about Pauline as well. But after he died, after he killed himself in 1961, the pages of it, there was a sheet of paper still in the typewriter that he had been working on, part of the stories. Before he died, he was sent twice to the Mayo Clinic for electric shock therapy. And while he was there on the last visit, which was just prior to when he killed himself, he was working on the final chapter of it that was about basically it's just, everybody quotes some of the things in this final chapter. It's actually really moving and beautiful. But once he realized that actually it's all about Hadley. So when he writes these stories about, when we were young and, there's never an ending to Paris, all of this, he's not meaning as much about Paris itself. He means the Paris that he knew of with Hadley. And it's a lot more about Hadley than it is Paris.
And didn't his last wife not like that or something? She made him change everything?
So after he died, and they found these papers and, he was just a pack rat. He saved every single thing in his life, every piece of paper, everything, which for, now we are really happy that he did that because we also have all of these letters and everything that he actually said he never wanted published. He didn't want them to do anything with his letters. She ended up sending them all off. They're now in the museum in Boston, the JFK Museum. There's also the Ernest Hemingway Museum within it. His letters are all there, but she, gave them to be published. So for the movable feast, A.E. Hotchner was a close friend of his. He's actually written some really great books about Hemingway. They were very close. And she, after he died, she actually also said it was an accident that he didn't kill himself. But after he died, she talked to Hotchner and said, we have all these things, what should we do with it? So she ended up actually reaching out to a gentleman named Harry Brogg, which was a editor at Scribner's, which they ended up working on them on the what would become movable feast. And she basically, between Mary and Harry, they ended up actually editing a lot of what he had written. They ended up taking some things out about Hadley and Pauline.
Hmm.
They edited part of it where, a lot of the impression that people get from that book is about F. Scott Fitzgerald and how horrible he was to F. Scott
Hmm.
Fitzgerald in the book. But that was something in the editing that Mary and Harry ended up actually making it look even worse for Hemingway.
So why would they want to do that?
I really don't know why. I mean, she tried to be so controlling in some ways of his story and his narrative, but then she went against his wishes, between the book, between the letters, also, of course, the painting, the Miro's painting of the farm. She would actually destroy things, with letters and things that he said, this is my intention. This painting belongs to Hadley, all these different things. She would destroy those things. So it was a little bit more self-serving for her in the end, than anything else. She didn't, he still was in contact with Hadley for the rest of his life. I don't think Mary liked that. So she had a bunch of things in the book kind of skewed to make him look worse. And also to kind of change some of the story of Hadley and Pauline. But in 2011, it was actually completely restored. It was restored back to his original intention. There's different parts of the book where it has, 7 or 8 different endings for a chapter, because that is actually, he couldn't decide what he wanted it to be. Some of the chapters are expanded, like the Fitzgerald stories and some of that. If you're going to read one copy of Movable Feast, that is the one. It's the 2011 restored edition. That is the one to find. It also tells kind of the story of Mary and what she did in the beginning of the book. But it is fascinating, and it's just really interesting because a lot of people hold that book up as like the Bible of Hemingway, and he did still at times take, there's stories in there that he ended up, changing. Maybe they actually happened in Cuba, but he says it's Paris. And there's, I mean, he was an author and everything, but a lot of people take every single thing he's ever wrote is like, this was the truth in the moment of his life.
Yeah, and like it's hard to say. I thought they did republish it later though, right? With like more of his own wording.
The 2011 version, yeah, that I just
Yeah.
mentioned, the 2011 restored edition is the one that they is basically his version.
Yeah, I'm glad they were able to do him some justice.
Yeah, yeah. So, and then it just makes me more mad about Mary.
More
People,
mad about
a lot
Mary.
of people hate Pauline because of what she did to Hadley, but I don't think Pauline holds a candle to Mary. Mary is the worst.
Yeah, Mary doesn't get enough crap.
No, people need to, yeah. And in the documentary, they made it, Mary, he was not a perfect man. He definitely had a lot of flaws. He definitely had a lot of issues. He was a bit of a bully. He wasn't that fantastic to all of the women in his life. But Mary was also, they kind of made it sound in the documentary that he was just horrible to her and all this stuff, but they didn't talk about any of the part of how she was to him and how they would actually get in like physical fights. And, she would be screaming and scratching and yelling. And some of the times that she would actually start the fights.
Oh my
Um,
God, it sounds
but
abusive.
yeah, but they left all of that out. They just made it sound like he was the one who did it. So it's like, I'm not defending everything that he did, but they just kind of kept skewing it more just towards, let's just add one more thing about how bad he
Mhm.
is.
Mhm. Yeah, they kept messing with the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah. But the other, probably the second most famous story of Hemingway is the story of the liberation of Paris. At the end of World War II, he kind of stepped over the line of from being a journalist to deciding he wanted to actually be a soldier. And he was in France, and he would basically kind of go and hang out in these camps where all the American soldiers were and the French soldiers, and just kind of like, I'm just going to get a gun and hang out with you and shoot people. He ended up
I
being
love how he just like
court-martialed.
signed himself up.
Yeah, he ended up being court-martialed later because they were like, no, you are a journalist. You don't get to do this." It ended up getting thrown out. But I mean, that goes back to him creating this myth, constantly creating this myth, even at the time he was, he just wanted to be this cool, cool, strong guy. And, he was, in World War One. So, but he ended up on August 25th, 1944. He was out in Rambouillet, which is 27 miles southwest of Portland. He was there with the FFI soldiers and American troops. And, this is when, it's the liberation of Paris is going on. And so he decided he wanted to go, be part of the action. So he liberated a Mercedes that was, kind of like a what we think of as a Jeep. It was a Mercedes Jeep kind of thing. And now today it's like, ooh, fancy, but it wasn't quite like that. But he had a couple, of the soldiers in with him as they slowly, there's this huge convoy of American and FFI troops coming in to Paris, and they were slowly moving down the road, going through all these small towns. As they went through these towns, and he is in this open Jeep with all, a bunch of men in the Jeep with him. They ended up, every town they go into, they just keep handing him bottles of wine, bottles of champagne everywhere they went. By the time they got into Paris, they had over 100 bottles in their car.
That's amazing.
That people were just kept throwing at them and giving them. So once they came into Paris, they just started passing it out, to people on the standing on the side of the street, cheering and so happy that, finally this nightmare in Paris was going to be over. First, of course, he went to Rue de l'Odéon. He went there and he came down Rue de l'Odéon to number 18, and he screamed in his big booming voice, "Sylvia, Sylvia!" And Sylvia Beach came running down to see him. They hugged because they had always been very close. He ended up going up on the roof because he asked what he could do for her, and she said, "You could put an end to this, the gunshots." And so he went up on the roof with a bunch of his men, and ended up there was gunfire, and then it stopped. And that was it for the German occupation of Odeon. Because even during, the liberation, there was still fighting going on.
Yeah, the Germans were holding on, I guess.
Yeah, they were still holding on. So then he decided, well, now I'm going to the Ritz. I'm going to go liberate the Ritz. So he actually got a hold of General Leclerc, who was, basically the leader of all these things. There's the museum, the Liberation Museum in Paris, that's right across from the entrance to the catacombs. It's absolutely amazing museum. It's so cool, but it's basically dedicated to him. It's a whole bunch of stuff of the story of his life. He basically was like, Hemingway's like, "I'm here and I'm going to save the Ritz and I need some weapons and some men." And the guy, he actually told him to buzz off.
Oh, that's so funny.
And so he rode over to the right bank and he came around the Arc de Triomphe and then went to, the Ritz, and he went strutting on in there, all macho and saying, "Where are they? Tell me where the Germans are." And the manager said, they are gone. They have been gone for days now.
Mm.
So he said, but you can't bring your machine guns in here. And so Hemingway said, okay. So he and his men, they put the machine guns back into the Jeep, ended up only having, small guns with them. And then they decided, because he was going to go there and liberate the cellar of the Ritz.
The cellar.
The cellar. So he ended up going in there and ended up, all of the men, they went back to the Ritz bar. So when you are there in Paris and you go to the Ritz, which you should go to the Bar Hemingway, the bar across the hall from the Bar Hemingway is the actual bar where he was, which is just the Ritz bar. So the Bar Hemingway, that's named after him, that's everything in there is about him, is not where he ever was.
I remember we talked about this last time. I was very disappointed to learn that for 30 euros a cocktail.
Yeah, they do say that later on that he did come in there, but at the time it was actually considered, and it was called the ladies' bar. And so it was only for the ladies, because across the hall, the much larger size bar was for men. So the story goes, and even the Ritz on their website have it incorrect. And I actually one day had somebody send me a message and argue with me about this fact. But he went in there, and the story goes that, and everybody, major publications tell the story, that he sat down and he drank by himself 51 martinis.
That sounds like you would keel over.
You would die. Anybody would die, especially because he liked a very specific martini called the Marshall Martini. And what this was is that it was actually made of 17 parts gin
Oh.
to 1 part vermouth. And it was named after the British Marshal Montgomery, who said he liked his martinis the way he liked his odds. He liked 17 soldiers to 1 German. So
Giuseppe
that
loves
was the
martinis.
Marshall Martini. So the
Marshall.
story actually is that it was Hemingway and like 17, 18 other men. And between them all, they drank 51 martinis.
Is that what's written on the Ritz website?
No, the Ritz website says that Hemingway came in there and drank 51 martinis.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is. I mean, all of these things are like, if that's true, oh, it's the trunk that was created by Louis Vuitton's very own hands, that it sounds amazing. It adds to this larger than life persona that he could put away 51 martinis at 17 parts gin.
So did you read this information, or are we just assuming because we know he would die?
They have all of these different, because of his letters being published,
Yeah.
which he did not want. The Cambridge Society is publishing them. There is going to be, I think it's going to be 16 or 17 different editions. They've now just done the first 5 editions, like up until 1938. They are absolutely fascinating to read. It has all of his letters, and then what they have done is they've researched part of like every one of the letters. So if he says in there, who he's talking to, or he refers to things, it was this is the next myth I have. This is where you actually could get some of the information, but they expand on it, and they actually did all this research on it. But then, later on, there was actually one of the guys that was actually with him that day that was riding in the Jeep from Rambouillet that actually also said, no, it was all of us that drank those martinis.
I love that stories are just, stories for fun, but yeah, it does get really built up, and then people really start believing all this crazy.
But I mean, even the Ritz, but that's the thing. I mean, they're also, also saying that here's this bar Hemingway, and they like to, people like to imagine that that's where he sat all day. And it's like, no, it's across the hall, it's like, but it adds to the romance, and it adds to the, the fun of the story. But it's just kind of frustrating when it's like, Forbes. It was an article that was in like Forbes, that they published recently because it was a huge anniversary of his death. There was also a whole bunch of, like, every article I saw had 3 or 4 of the things that weren't exactly true.
Yeah, I think they just don't do their research as well as you. You should be working at that library, doing the research on those.
I know. I'm going to do that. But yeah, so that's, I mean, and it is, I do kind of, I take it personally.
As you should.
But yeah, but another story, and this is actually where reading his letters actually is really amazing. So on December 2nd, 1922, and if, some of these things, if you listen to our Hadley episode we did all about Hadley, we really go into more details on some of these things. But on December 2nd, 1922, Hadley decided to go to the Gare de Lyon, to travel over to Luzon to visit him. He was there to write about these peace talks that were going on. He met another American journalist there, and he was telling him all about these books, the things that he was starting to write. And Hadley was sick at home, so that's why she didn't go with him. And she was starting to feel better, so she decided she was going to go because he kept saying, oh, I wish I had, this thing to show him. I wish I had that thing. So she thought she would be really nice and pack up all of the manuscripts that he had and all of the, carbon copies of things that he had been working on, and put them in a case and go to the Gare de Lyon and grab a train and just, whisk off to Switzerland and meet her husband. Well, she got to the train station a little early. The valet put her one bag up, above her head, and the other bag she left sitting on the seat. And she thought, "Oh, I'm a little early. I'm going to go back out and get some water." So she goes out to get some water. She comes back, and the one case was gone.
I mean, how could she?
It's just, but now it's like in this day and age, it's like you wouldn't ever leave something unattended.
I don't think Paris was any safer back then.
Yeah, no. So she came back, noticed it was gone, started asking, the valets and everybody, where's this stuff? Did you see anything? Nobody saw anything. So she had to take this entire train ride to Switzerland. She gets there, she meets him. He's standing there outside. She's completely just sick, to tell him. And she told him, and he was actually kind of took it pretty well. But the famous part of the story, and he even put this in Movable Feast, that he basically says that he returned immediately to Paris to come back to see if there was really everything was gone.
He didn't believe her.
The fact was, this was the beginning of December. He didn't return back to Paris until the end of January. And we know that because he wrote these letters saying that he just went, it was in there dated. And he, at the end of January, he wrote a friend and said that, "Oh, I've just returned to Paris to see," and he writes about what she did, what happened. And, everybody's, this people just say, "Oh, everything was missing," but some of his stuff actually was with Gertrude Stein. Some of it was these poems that he wrote were actually they were sent to a publisher. So not everything was gone, but in the same way, it probably was good that he did lose everything, because then he started over and his voice was different when he started over to more of what we know of it today.
I mean, I guess he forgave her because they stayed together after that too.
They did, yeah. I mean, it's, like the Paris Wife, the book, the historical novel. And she, they definitely kind of err on the side of like that was part of like the catalyst that ruined their relationship. But he actually took it pretty well. There's quite a few different letters in these books that he talks about it, and he took it pretty well. And even one of the letters say from a friend saying, like, "Oh, you're handling this pretty well." I would be, I mean, it'd be like us today if you lost your laptop. I mean, that would just be, you'd be beside yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is kind of interesting. But it also was around that same time, they came to Paris at the end of December 1921. He had in his hand a bunch of different letters from his friend Sherwood, who had been to Paris before, and wrote a bunch of different letters of introduction for him to give to many people, including a lovely little shop owner named Sylvia Beach, who had a store called Shakespeare and Company. She just that spring before that, she had moved it from the original location on Rue des Pétrins, which was just right off of Rue Monsieur de Prince, and moved it around the corner to Rue de l'Odéon, number 12. He ended up walking in there on December 28th, 1921. And he didn't hand her one of the letters. They just instantly started talking and became very good friends. The two of them would actually go off. He would take her and Adrian to boxing matches and cycling events, and like teach them all these things about sports.
That's so fun.
Which is adorable. So they ended up becoming very good friends. It was, definitely probably one of the few women in his life that up until the end of his life still thought he was fantastic, and they were still very close friends into those final years. But the location that is in Paris now that we know of, the Shakespeare and Company, the fantastic store that's down there by Notre Dame, while it was reopened, and it was by George Whitman. It was originally called La Mistral. It was then, after Sylvia Beach died, it was then changed to to Shakespeare and Company. He named his daughter Sylvia Beach Whitman, But I've had many people say, "Oh, I went to Shakespeare and Company, and I just imagined the days that Hemingway and James Joyce were there." And I'm like, "Oh, actually,
Not the same one.
it's not the same one. It is definitely has that feeling, and it harkens back to that amazing story, of what she did. And it's based, it's definitely an homage to her. But that location, if you want to be at the location where they all, Gertrude Stein, all of them, they had their mail sent there, or they would hang out there every single day. You have to go to the wonderful Rue de l'Odéon, number 12. I think it's a clothing store now. But you could stand outside of it and pretend and
Or you can just go
reimagine it.
stand in the clothing store.
Yeah, it is a clothing store now. But there is still, there's still quite a few bookstores actually on that street. And that was where a lot of the literary presses were and bookstores. So it's it's even cooler to go around the corner to see where her original store is. A lot of times people will call the Shakespeare Company that is currently there now the second one, when actually it would be, I guess, the third one. But it was not, Sylvia Beach herself didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah, that's really like kind of disappointing when you learn that because you like to imagine all those wonderful people hanging
Yeah,
out there.
I know. I'm just squashing everybody's
Killing all the dreams.
it's squashing everybody's dreams. Yeah. But another one was, Gertrude Stein. It's his relationship with Gertrude Stein is rather notorious. He also did meet her at that same time. He actually met her on March 8th, 1922. It was another one that he had a letter from Sherwood. They ended up meeting, and they took to each other very quickly. He and Hadley would go over to her house that was, on the other side of the Jardin de Luxembourg, and hang out there. She ended up having these salons that, everybody would come to because her walls were literally filled with art, floor to ceiling. She was, collecting Cezanne and Matisse and Picasso and all of these that were contemporaries. They were alive and living and painting in Paris. And so she would hang out with all of them. Hemingway, really encouraged her to write the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And she would really encourage him to pinpoint his writing. He would give her some of his stuff he was working on, and then she would come back and say, no, it's too much. You need to change it. You need to go to the Musée de Luxembourg and go look at the paintings that Cezanne does and look at how he pinpoints, and especially his still life, it could just be a bowl of some apples, and how something so simple tells so much. And so he would actually go to the Musée de Luxembourg hungry. He believed it was better to go and look at art when you're hungry, because you retain more, and you're starving to fill something. And so he would go there and see these things. And then, it really helped hone in the way his very specific style that everybody knows today. So, but he encouraged her to write too. So she, he was saying, you need to finish this. You need to write this. So it's called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, who was the partner of Gertrude Stein. In the book, she was pretty brutal to Hemingway as well as Picasso. And this was, in the 1930s. And when they got a copy of the book, both Picasso and Hemingway, they basically were enraged and didn't want to have anything to do with it ever again. He basically would later, strike out against her and sometimes say things against her in the press. The Ken Burns show basically only tells the side of the story of him basically saying, she's horrible. And it was something like a bitch is a bitch is a bitch. It was one of the things he said about her. But they don't tell anything. They don't tell the other story where she was the one that wrote this book saying horrible things about Hemingway and the Lost Generation and also Picasso.
Yeah, so I mean, it was on both sides.
Yes, it was definitely on both sides, which is, again, not saying what he did was right, but interesting that they didn't want to put the other side of the story.
Yeah, we need all the sides.
We need all the sides. But yeah, so they, she definitely honed in all these things. She was really critical to the Lost Generation in general. She just thought that they, were just good for nothing. Definitely everybody go back and listen to the episode we did about Gertrude Stein. You'd probably be pretty shocked. There's definitely part of her life that nobody writes about the fact that she believed Hitler deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, that she was translating his speeches into English, and she wanted them to be published, and her publisher told her to buzz off. She was basically kind of collaborating with the Nazis to keep her art and her collection safe. She was a Jewish lesbian, and she thought that she was entitled to safety because she was rich.
Yeah, that's kind of not great.
No, it kind of definitely, but really turned you off about Gertrude Stein.
Not the best side.
Not the best side, but there's a whole bunch of other stories, like there's the three big cafes there in Saint Germain, the Café du Magot, Café Fleur, and Brasserie Lippe. All of them like to, they all very heavily rest on the stories of, Jean-Paul Sartre and Picasso and all of these people that went there, including Hemingway. But he actually preferred the Brasserie Lippe across the way. Because it was all of the other guys were going to Fleur and du Magot. So he, especially those early days when he had a few extra, francs, he would go to Brasserie Lippe and then order the sausage and the potatoes in olive oil, and then have a mug of beer and soak up the olive oil with the bread. And he just absolutely loved it. He did write about that in Movable Feast. And sometimes it was a good month of writing, he would get a second mug of beer.
Living the high life.
I live in the high life. But, if you go through Movable Feast, it's, I don't want to spoil it for people. And it is a fantastic book. But, like there's he liked to tell people in the book, he wrote about how when he was hungry, he would stroll through the Luxembourg with Bumby in his stroller, and he'd pick up pigeons and break their neck so they could cook them, so they'd have something to eat. A lot of people that kind of thought that actually did not happen. There was, after he married Pauline, he was having some issues in the bedroom, we could say, and she was a very devout Catholic, and she said, you should go and pray about this. And so in the book, he says how he went to Saint Sulpice, and he, went and found a saint that he, thought was, a good one, and basically prayed to this saint, and then went back home and, took Pauline into the bedroom, and everything was fine. That story actually happened in Key West. It didn't happen in Paris. But, it all adds to the fun stories of his life. It's the ones where it's the martinis and some of these other ones that are just not correct that just kind of drive me crazy.
Yeah, completely wrong. I think his life is fascinating. I'm not a huge fan of his writing, but I love his story. I think his story's great.
Yeah, and a lot of people come to me and say that they read, they were forced to read it in school. I think every high schooler has to read one of his books at some point in school. And
I did.
And I've had a lot of people say that, or or they don't like the stories of, it's the whole Hadley Pauline thing because of that. Also because of that novel, The Paris Wife. It really, that really got that story out there. Or some people say to me, oh, but he was so horrible to his boys. But that's not, he was actually very close with them when he would see him, because he was jetting off to, Key West and Cuba and Africa and all this stuff. But when he did have his boys, he absolutely loved spending time with them. And they'd go out on the Pilar and go fishing. So a lot of people, that's the problem with the myths. They get this one idea stuck in their head, and then they can't really get past that. But I do tell people, if they've read The Movable Feast before, I'm like, actually read the restored edition. They have restored some of his other biggest, The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms and For Whom the Bell Tolls, they restored a lot of those as well, with his notes in there. I think For Whom the Bell Tolls has like 10 different endings because he wrote 10 different endings. So you could actually read all of them.
Wow.
So if you did read them and you were in high school and you're like, oh, I don't want to read anything from that period, then maybe, try one of them again. And if you love Paris, try The Moveable Feast or The Sun Also Rises, which starts in Paris and then, heads down to Spain, and give it a shot again. Cause you might in your old age now like it.
My old age.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for telling us the myths of the legend. Maybe we can all look at Hemingway in a different way and do our own research or be more open-minded about his life. And don't forget to join Claudine's virtual tours every weekend, every Sunday. She walks around Paris with you, giving you live history on Zoom. And she does tour planning as well. So check out ClaudineHemingway.com and tune into the podcast next week.
Thank you for listening to Paris History Avec a Hemingway. If you want to find out some more, you could always find me on my Instagram page, Claudine Bleu Blanc Rouge, and that's BLEU, as in the French way to spell it. And each day I post a daily history lesson about a person or a place or something in Paris, or it's lots of fun facts. And then also at ClaudineHemingway.com, where you can also sign up for my newsletter there.